Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Language Arts class. Today, we are going to be looking at part two of our reading of the Wanderings of Odysseus, and today we are going to get into Odysseus's battle against the great and mighty Polyphemus, the Cyclops. So, let's go ahead and open up our books here to page 51, bottom of the page, and let's get started here. Their next call was at the island of Sicily, home of the Cyclops. So first off, remember, we left off here with the land of the Lotus Eaters, which is on the coast of Africa, where Odysseus lost many men to this powerful drug, but they fled that island, and now they have landed on the island of Sicily, which is actually part of today Italy, but this is the land of the Cyclops. Land of the Cyclops. All right, continuing on. These were giant men, wild and unkempt, who lived on human flesh. Each one had one eye only, gleaming balefully from the middle of his forehead. The terrible Polyphemus, taller even than all the rest, was their leader. He was a son of Poseidon and a nymph, and in his early days he and his followers had led a more peaceful life. They had worked in the island forge doing fine metalwork and making thunderbolts for Zeus, guided by the watchful smith god Hephaestus. But under the evil influence of Polyphemus, they had abandoned their trade and now lived by preying on the towns and villages of the countryside, stealing corn in herds and frightening the people. So the important thing to remember from this is that Polyphemus is actually the son of Poseidon. And remember, Poseidon is not a friend of Odysseus, right? They have already kind of gone back and forth, and it was Poseidon who had blown Odysseus so far off course and why he ended up on the land of the Lotus Eaters. Well, now he's about to come face to face with one of Poseidon's sons, Polyphemus. Okay, reading on here. All of this was unknown to Odysseus, and when he and his men had landed, they set out to explore. They climbed the steep hillside above the bay where they had anchored, making their stop between the rocks and boulders that dotted the slope. Ahead of them was a low cliff, and as they drew near to it, they could see the opening of a cave. In front of it, some long-eared goats were grazing. "Wait here," Odysseus told his men, "and keep out of sight." The men took cover behind the rocks, while their leader went on alone, moving with great caution. Close to the cave, he paused and listened, but there was no sound except the sighing of the wind across the bleak hillside. He was reassured, but nonetheless, he drew his sword, and as he crossed the last few meters to the cave entrance and looked inside. At first, it was too dark to make out anything, but as his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, he could see that the place was empty. It was much larger than he had imagined from outside, but there was no sign that it was occupied. There was only a pile of bones in one corner, indicating that it had been, or possibly still was, the lair of a wild animal of some kind. If so, the animal was not there now. Odysseus and his men would give it a rough welcome if and when it returned. So they find a nice cave to spend the night in that they think will keep them protected. All right, reading on. Odysseus went out into the afternoon sunshine and called to his men. "We will make this our camp until we can find a better one," he said. "Tomorrow we will look for a town or village and buy grain and oil and other provisions. For today we could do worse than feast on goat's meat." The men set to work killing some of the goats and roasting them over a fire, which they had lit in the cave. They squatted in a circle around the fire as they ate hungrily. Fresh meat was something they had not seen for many weeks. Evening was drawing in by the time they had finished, and the light in the cave was fading fast. Then, with dramatic suddenness, it vanished completely. Foolishly, they had posted no sentries, and they had heard no sound. Now, when they looked round to see why it had gone so dark, they saw the gigantic figure of Polyphemus blocking the cave entrance completely, his single eye glowing red in the light from the fire. He was a terrifying sight. Even Odysseus was afraid, though he put on a brave show. So now they are essentially trapped in the cave. The only way out is through Polyphemus. "Can it be, stranger, that we have inadvertently made ourselves free with your flocks and your home?" he asked. "If so, you must pardon us, for we are strangers, and it seemed the place was deserted." But the giant only grunted in reply. Then he turned and went outside once more. Odysseus sprang to his feet. "Quickly," he said. "Before he comes back, we must get—" But he had no time to finish his sentence, for the cave mouth had darkened once again as Polyphemus came back, driving his flock of goats in front of him. Once inside, he pulled a gigantic boulder across the cave mouth so that it was closed completely. Then, ignoring Odysseus and his companions, he lay down on the floor. Soon his snores echoed through the cave like thunder. All right, so this is kind of interesting here. Polyphemus, first thing he does is he traps them in there. Right, so he pulls his goats in, and then he has a gigantic boulder that he pulls across the opening of the cave. One so heavy that none of Odysseus' men could move it. But then he just flops on the ground and goes to sleep. So Polyphemus is showing us here that he has no fear of these men. He doesn't fear him, and he's willing to even sleep with enemies in his own cave because he doesn't think they can do anything to harm him. So this shows a kind of arrogance that Polyphemus has. And would be a good thing to add to your guys' character lists under Polyphemus is that he is very arrogant, right, or overconfident would be a good thing to add there. And as we'll see, it's going to come back to bite him. Okay, continuing on. As it seemed unlikely that any sound they made would wake him, the men began to talk together, though they kept their voices low. "I have heard of giants such as these," Odysseus said. "It would seem that we are among the Cyclopses, which is not the happiest place to be." "Do they not feed on human flesh?" one of the sailors asked. Odysseus nodded. "So they say, but they may go several days between their feasting," he told them. "Just the same, only luck has saved us from being roasted on this fire. We must escape as quickly as possible, for who knows what tomorrow may bring." So, not great. Essentially, Polyphemus is acting like the humans are just his goats, right? That they'll just be in there alive until he decides to eat them, and then he'll eat them. They crept quietly to the cave entrance, but try as they might, the gigantic boulder which blocked the opening could not be moved. Eventually, they had to give up. They dared not attack the giant while he slept, for even if they did succeed in killing him, they would still be trapped. So that's the problem with this. Even if they kill Polyphemus in his sleep, that's not going to help them because they're still trapped in the cave behind this gigantic rock. So they have to come up with a new plan to get out of here. An uneasy night passed. In the morning, Polyphemus drove the goats from the cave and pulled the rock across the opening from outside. They saw no more of him that day. The imprisoned men passed each hour in dread. Another night must inevitably come, and with it, who knew what horrors. But while some of the men gave themselves up to despair, Odysseus was busy plotting and planning. After a while, he thought of a possible way in which they could escape. He took a shaft of wood, and after sharpening one end, hardened it in the embers of a fire. Then he hid it under a goat skin on the floor and settled down to wait with the others. So, remember Odysseus's kind of claim to fame is being the most intelligent of all the heroes. So coming up with plans is his specialty, which he's going to do here. So he takes a long stick, sharpens it, and then hardens the end in a fire. Okay, it says, that night Polyphemus came back and behaved just as he had done before. He brought in the flock of goats, moved the great slab of rock across the entrance, and settled down to sleep. Perhaps he had already fed, or perhaps the band of Greeks were just lucky to have been in the cave during a period of fast, but soon his snores rumbled through the cavern once more. When he judged that the night was nearly gone, Odysseus crept quietly to where the wooden shaft was hidden. Taking it out from under the skin, he heated the point in the fire until its sharpened end glowed red. Before it had time to cool, he had crossed the cave to the sleeping figure and plunged the glowing stake in Polyphemus' single eye. With a great roar of rage and pain, the blinded giant staggered to his feet. Helplessly, he blundered about the cave, arms outstretched, trying vainly to find his attackers, as they dodged away, always managing to keep behind him. At length he gave up and felt his way towards the entrance to the cave. Once there, he groped for the boulder and pushed it aside, but he did not venture out. Instead, he crouched, waiting by the opening, his huge, hairy fingers curled like talons. Obviously, he knew the men would try to escape as soon as they could, and he was ready to seize them as they tried to pass him. Okay, So they take, as soon as Polyphemus goes to sleep, they take this giant or this large sharpened wooden stick that they've created and jam it in Polyphemus's eye, which blinds him, right? But there's still a problem. The door is still blocked by this boulder. So what Polyphemus does is he pushes the boulder aside, but he doesn't go outside. He waits in front of it with his arms outstretched. So he's trying to get the humans and Odysseus to try to run past him, and he'll try to grab them as they run out so he can kill them. Okay, so not out of the woods yet. Reading on, Odysseus had briefed his men well. Already each had captured a goat, and now clasping the long hairs of the goat's side, they hung underneath them as the frightened animals made for the doorway. Hearing the scuffle of their hooves on the stone floor, Polyphemus made to feel about, but all his hands touched was the familiar hair of the goat's back, and he suspected nothing. One by one, the goats trotted past him out into the open air, and with them went the men to freedom. So the men hid underneath the goats, and as the goats walked out, Polyphemus was feeling the top of them, but all he felt was the goat hair. He couldn't feel the humans. So they were able to sneak out that way. Okay, it says they lost no time in scrambling down the hill to their ship. As they rowed clear of the shore and hoisted their sail, Odysseus, standing in the stern, raised his voice and cried, "Farewell, blind god giant. Know that it was not the gods who took your sight, but mere weak men, whom you could have destroyed with one finger." At the sound, Polyphemus came from the cave, the huge boulder with which it had been closed held high above his head. "Farewell," Odysseus called yet again. The giant turned to the direction of the sound and hurled the boulder with all of his strength after the fleeing ship. Then he stumbled to his knees. The boulder fell short, but not much more than a boat's length from the ship's stern. The vessel rocked dangerously, but it soon recovered itself. The crew looked back to see Polyphemus, a lonely, helpless figure, kneeling on the hillside. So this last section here, after they escape, shows one of Odysseus' biggest weaknesses. And another good thing to put in your guys' character list, go to Odysseus. Odysseus is prideful. And what I mean by that is Odysseus often outsmarts people, but he likes to rub their faces in it. So they could have just left after getting past Polyphemus, but that wasn't enough for Odysseus. He had to turn around and insult Odysseus as they left, which was almost a bad thing, because Polyphemus, using his ears and where he could hear Odysseus from, threw this giant boulder, which easily could have killed them, but he just missed. And none of that would have happened if Odysseus just would have kept his trap shut and not insulted Polyphemus after they had escaped. But he just can't help himself. And Odysseus' pride is going to cost him and his men, as we'll see throughout this story. Okay, last thing we need to do then is we need to fill out section 6 here of our 12 Steps of the Hero's Journey. And we had left off with this section right here where it says Odysseus arrives at the land of the Lotus Eaters and loses many men to the drug. So now we need our next line about Polyphemus. So in this one, Odysseus and his men face the mighty Cyclops Polyphemus, who they leave blinded. All right, so something along those lines there for our section on Polyphemus that you need to add. All right, once you go ahead and add those, you are done for this section, and I will talk to you guys in the next video.